All right. All right. All right. Sorry about the technical difficulties, guys, but I'm glad we're finally here. We got a lot to get through. So I'll go ahead and start with the introductions. So this is the AP Euro semester review, fall semester review. So we're going to be covering just over half of the content for the class. So Unit 1 through Unit 5, pretty much. I'm going to try to get through everything that we possibly can. We started about 25 minutes late, unfortunately. But hopefully we can kind of get through some stuff. We can get through what we need to. And yeah, hopefully you guys will feel nice and reviewed. So I hope everybody's having a great Thursday night. Thanks for tuning in. So we will go ahead and get started here right now. Now, real quick, one thing I want to say, let me go ahead and share my screen here. Share my screen with, let's go over here. We're going to share this first. Okay. So we can all see this. Perfect. So this is the course and exam description for AP European History. And if you tuned in to my to my first live stream that I did, I talked a little bit about the course and exam description and why it's so important for this course. And I'll talk a little bit more about it. And the big thing I really want to say is that this is everything you need to know about the class in terms of content. Okay. So it goes through every single unit and then indicator within that unit, which I think is incredibly valuable, especially for those. And I know we have a lot of people that use Fiveable for self-studying, for taking the exams, teaching themselves, and I think this is really, really incredibly valuable. I wanted to say that again, and we're going to go ahead now and get started with the semester review here. Let's see, presenter view. This is what I want. Is presenter view. Okay, perfect. Now, before I get started, I know we're probably gonna have people that are trickling in and out. If you could, all questions that you have, and I really, really encourage you to ask questions, please put them in the questions tab. That way I don't miss anything. And then we can kind of go back at the end and look at them. I'm probably gonna move pretty fast. So if there's anything that either A, I leave out that you want me to hit on, or B, you want me to go back to and talk about more, just put that in the questions tab. Okay. Say, can you talk about Northern Renaissance again, or something like that. But also, I am going to be moving pretty quickly. We have 5 units to get through, which is a lot. So I'm not going to be hitting everything, and I'm not going to be hitting everything. I'm not going to be hitting really anything in a lot of detail. It's really just going to be, this is what we need to look at. And, this is what you should be knowing. Okay. So that being said, let's dive on into it. So first of all, of course, I want to talk about Fiveable here just real quick. That's their information right there. That's follow them on social media. I'm going to be posting for sure this PowerPoint, but also be posting at least one other infographic on the Fiveable website. So if you want this stuff, sign up for Fiveable, sign up for the monthly membership, and you get access to that stuff. Okay. But this is what we're going to be doing, starting first with a quick introduction and then going into looking at the different units. There's 5 units that we're going to be covering here. The Renaissance and the Age of Exploration, the Reformation and the Wars of Religion, Absolutism and Constitutionalism, the Scientific Revolution, Enlightenment and Old Regime, and then I'm finishing up with French Revolution and Napoleon. Okay, so this is what we're going to be covering. It's a lot of stuff, but let's go ahead and dig on in. So a little bit of kind of overarching introduction type stuff here. First of all, we know there are 4 periods in AP European history. Period 1 being 1350 to 1648. 1350 is kind of the year I say period 1 starts on, because that's where really I start teaching, is in right around 1350. But I think technically it's like 1400 to 1648 is what College Board says, but whatever, same difference. Period 2 is 1648 to 1815, so Peace of Westphalia, all the way to the Congress of Vienna. Period 3, 1815 to 1914. So Congress of Vienna all the way to the start of World War One. And then period 4 is 1914 to 2020. So 1914 to today. Okay. So period 1 is Unit 1 and Unit 2. Period 2 is Unit 3, Unit 4, and Unit 5. Unit 3 kind of crosses over between the two of them. But that's generally how we kind of set it up. All right. It's period 1 is Unit 1 and Unit 2. Period 2 is Unit 3, 4, and 5. Okay. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump right in to the first unit here. Unit 1 is Renaissance and Exploration. All right. So you'll see at the top that those headers are going to tell you which unit we're currently in. Unit 1 obviously is Renaissance and Exploration, like it says, and those are going to change as we kind of move through. But I'll of course talk a little bit about that. But if you want to use this PowerPoint to study later on, that's how you can know. Okay. So first of all, let's talk about the main ideas of this unit. All right. So first, the crisis of the late Middle Ages. We got to talk about the end of the Middle Ages to understand how we get from the Middle Ages to the what we say like the modern era, okay, which starts with the Renaissance. Then the Italian Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance, print culture, and finally finishing up with new monarchies here. All right, and then moving over to exploration, technology of exploration, rivalry and exploration, and then the Colombian Exchange and slave trade. All right, so those are all the big main ideas of Unit 1. So you should be familiar with all of those. All right, but let's dig in a little bit and talk about each of those individually. Starting first with the crises of the late Middle Ages. All right, so there's a few things that happen, okay, that we can point to as being we call them the crises of the late Middle Ages, but that help bring us out into the modern era. So first is the bubonic plague, right? The bubonic plague, which wipes out a third of Europe famously, and that is really going to be probably the biggest singular event that's going to cause the most widespread damage and then thus change that hits Europe. The 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War has a lot of effects besides just being a war that lasts for about 100 years, although on and off 100 years. It's going to do a lot for state building. We'll talk a little bit about the 100 Years' War again when we go to new monarchies, but this is your nationalism builder right here, the 100 Years' War. It really starts to separate specifically France and England. That creates the universal idea of being French or the idea of being British. That's 100 Years' War right there, okay? The peasant revolts, kind of tied into the 100 Years' War a little bit, but the peasant revolts revolting against the old feudal system of the Middle Ages that it just kind of stopped working. Of course, you can make the argument that the feudal system never worked, but the peasant revolts are really going to be, if we want to think about this as like a precursor to social change, this is really when people start saying, hey, it kind of sucks being tied to the land and not making any money. And then, of course, the Great Schism or the Avignon Papacy. This is going to really be kind of the start of the end, beginning of the end for the Catholic Church, right? The Great Schism, where we see the Catholic Church moving from Rome to Avignon in France, back to Rome, and then you have the multiple popes and the split Catholic Church, and just generally a big mess. All right. Now, why this is important? This pulls Europe out of the Middle Ages. All right. The crises of the late Middle Ages pull Europe out of the Middle Ages. These are all things going to make fundamental changes: religious, social, political, population changes to Europe. Okay. These are all big changes that are going to pull Europe out of the Middle Ages and throw them into the modern era. All right. Moving on, I want to talk briefly about the Renaissances, the Italian and the Northern Renaissance. First, starting with the Italian Renaissance. All right. Italian Renaissance rebirth. Okay. This is kind of the first big event of the modern era. So when we're thinking about Renaissance here, and this goes for not only Italian, but also for Northern Renaissance, which kind of gets the short end of the stick. We always want to talk about the Italian, but the Northern was arguably more important for social change than the Italian Renaissance was. The Italian Renaissance produced a lot of great art and a lot of great books, but the Northern Renaissance is equally just as important. But three characteristics. The first, a return to Greek and Roman thinking. All right, we call this a return to classical thinking, and this is using Greek and Roman thinking as real inspiration and as real understanding of how the world works. A renewed interest in secular matters, a renewed interest in matters that have to do with things other than religion. Okay, this is something that kind of ties in with the Greek and Roman thinking, which the Greeks and the Romans, while the religion played an important role in their society, they were also deeply, especially with Rome, they were really, really focused on civic manners. History was incredibly important. Art and politics. Okay, so part of the Renaissance is an interest in those civic manners, and we could probably sit here for a while and talk about how we see that in the Italian Renaissance. We can look at something like Machiavelli's The Prince, or we can talk about Baldassare Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, all pointing to a focus on matters outside of the church. And then lastly, of course, a greater appreciation for self, of the man, of the world that the man occupies. All right, and this all ties in to the big idea of humanism, and humanism is the big ism of the Renaissance. Okay, the appreciation of the man, of the individual, of the world he occupies, of his emotions, of his education. That is all wrapped up into humanism, and humanism is going to kind of be like this rock solid foundation that things like the Reformation and the Enlightenment, and later on the big social ideologies of the 1800s and the 1900s are going to all build off of. I mean, it starts now with the Renaissance. The Renaissance, in a lot of ways, lays a lot of foundation for a lot of more modern stuff, whether it's ideology like humanism or art. Now, when you think about why Italy, okay, of course, the economic superiority of Italy being in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, having access to a lot of those trade routes through the Byzantine Empire, and just generally being the center of trade for Europe. Also, they are a banking center, and we think about, who do we think about when we think about patronage? We think about the Medicis, Cosimo de' Medici specifically. Medicis were a banking family. So, banking center of Europe. Also, close proximity to Greece and in close proximity to Rome being really, really important here. Okay, so that is going to tie into that appreciation of Greek and Roman ideology. Okay, and then when the Byzantine Empire falls, and oh my God, I just blanked on the date when it falls, in the 1400s. When the Byzantine Empire falls in the 1400s, when the Ottoman Turks conquer the Byzantine Empire, conquer Constantinople, a lot of those old school Byzantine scholars, they're going to flee to Italy. They're going to flee from Greece. They're going to flee from Constantinople, and they're going to go to Italy. They're going to bring a lot of that ideology with them. A lot of those guys, they become teachers. They stay being scholars, and they're welcomed in with open arms by a lot of these wealthy merchants and wealthy bankers and wealthy nobility that really have taken a liking to Greek and Roman ideology. And then, of course, we have humanism tied into this, which I've already mentioned. Okay. Now, for the Northern Renaissance, is going to be a little bit different here. So first of all, the printing press and trade is what's going to move the Renaissance northward into France and Britain and Central Europe-ish. We say Germany, but Central Europe. That is, we also tend to call the humanists of the North Christian humanists, focusing on reforming Christianity, whereas the Italian humanists would have they would never ever talk about reforming Christianity, because that's very, very dangerous for being that close to the Pope. We point to Erasmus for this. Erasmus is the best example of a Christian humanist that we could possibly say. And then when we think about the art of the Northern Renaissance, it's a bigger focus on realism. It's a bigger focus on showing life as it actually was. Peter Bruegel is a really good example of a Northern Renaissance artist who focuses on life as it was. Albrecht Dürer is probably the most famous of the Northern Renaissance artists. He's big focus on realism, but also morbid realism. A lot of his woodcuts show really good are really good examples of that morbid realism, as opposed to someone like Michelangelo or Raphael, who is more focused on kind of showing humanity in its best sense, in its greatest capacity. So big differences between the art there, but like I said, we just don't have time to dig too far into that. But let's switch gears. We'll talk about the age of exploration now. I want to talk quickly about motivations for exploration. You guys can probably name this right now: prospect of new lands, economic motivations, and then religious zeal. The three G's: God, glory, and gold. And not necessarily in that order. Really, the gold was the biggest reason people explored. God kind of took a backseat to that one, but certainly God was really important when we're talking about why do people set out and go explore. And so those are the motivations for exploration, though. Easy to remember: God, glory, and gold. So talking about the technological advancements. So these are really, when we're thinking about them, we're thinking about advancements in navigation technology and understanding positioning in the sea or on the ocean, which is really important, but also technological advancements in mapping and technological advancements in sailing and adopting new shipbuilding techniques to make those long distances across the Atlantic Ocean. And then, of course, into the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, which you know, we kind of tend to forget about, but people were not just exploring across the Atlantic Ocean, even though that tends to be what we really kind of focus on and harp on. So when you think about leaders of exploration, Portugal leads the way for this by exploring Africa and setting up trade routes, trade posts and trade routes along the African coast. And then, of course, going to India. They're the first country that makes a successful voyage around Africa to India and then back. But Spain follows them pretty soon after that, with Spain, of course, going across the Atlantic Ocean to North America. And this leads us to the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divides up the world between Spain and Portugal, which is really interesting to think about. And this is organized by the Catholic Church, which is also really interesting. But you look at a map here, and it's just a line that goes pretty much straight down the earth, cuts through modern day Brazil, and then goes all the way down to the bottom. And everything on the left, everything to the west was for Spain. Everything to the east was for Portugal. But of course, the only really remnants we have of that today is that the Brazilians speak Portuguese, or Brazilians speak Portuguese, not Spanish. But the Treaty of Tordesillas is definitely, it's one of those things that it tends to be thrown in on the AP exam pretty often in a multiple choice question usually. But it's also a really good way. It's a good factoid to bring in when you're talking about how did Europeans view themselves in the world. The Treaty of Tordesillas, it's pretty bold, saying that Spain owns this half and Portugal owns the other half. So a nice little factoid to throw in there. And now Britain, France, and the Netherlands, they come in a little bit later, mostly in the 1600s, in late 1500s or early 1600s. But they come in with a vengeance. And we know that the British and the French spent a lot of time in North America. The Dutch, they are predominantly focused on some Caribbean islands, but also the 1600s, the Dutch are going to pretty much rule trade in Europe, and they're going to control trade in the Indian Ocean and in Southeast Asia. So they come in last, but they come in with a vengeance. Now, the Colombian Exchange, the movement of goods, people, and ideas across the Atlantic Ocean. This is something that, we've all been learning about since we were really young, the Colombian Exchange. But this is going to be really, really important for Europe, beyond just the fact that we know, the on the surface specifics, right? It moves food, it moves goods, it moves people, enslaved peoples, Europeans, non-Europeans, right? But more importantly, what this does is it gets Europe to situate itself in a more global capacity. And this is going to kind of be the theme, is how does Europe view itself in the world? And this is going to be really important as we keep kind of going, we have to remember that Europe is not just isolated in Europe anymore, right? That's the Middle Ages. We're out of the Middle Ages. Europe is now globalized. What happens in Europe doesn't stay in Europe, okay? This isn't Vegas. What happens in Europe also, that things are experienced outside of Europe in the colonies. All right, Europe is also invested. European countries are invested in other countries outside of the continent. Okay, so as we go on, the wars of the 1700s are a really good example of this. The wars of the 1700s, they don't just happen in Europe. They happen outside of Europe too. The 7 Years' War, we call it the French and Indian War in the United States, right? Because it was literally a world war. There was fighting that was taking place in Europe and in the Americas, and there was fighting that was taking place in India. Okay, so there was fighting taking place all over because Europe was now invested in the world, not just on the continent. Okay, so that's important to remember with the Age of Exploration. Now, the encomienda system, I also want to mention here really briefly. The system that the Spanish used to I don't want to say employ, because it wasn't employing. It was really just like de facto slavery. But it was Native Americans as laborers. Doesn't work. Native Americans turn out to be to know the land a little bit better than the Spanish, so they just leave. And they also weren't used to European disease, so 98% of Native Americans or something like that are killed from disease. So Native Americans turn out for Europeans to not be great laborers. And it's also, interestingly enough, the Catholic Church that says, hey, they're Christians, they're Catholic Christians, we can't treat them like this. And so we know what happens. The Europeans look to Africa. And really, it's because Europe had been dealing with Africa, and they know that slavery already existed in Africa, and they kind of take advantage of that fact. And they really take advantage of the fact that slavery already existed, and they turn to Africa for slaves. And so this is a great visualization of the Colombian Exchange, the movement of goods, of people, of ideas to and from the New World in Africa. So I'm not going to spend too much time. We're already 20 minutes in. So the 5 effects of exploration: increased power and wealth for European countries, war, like I mentioned, the spread of Christianity in European culture, mistreatment of native peoples resulting from ethnocentrism, the idea that one culture is better than another, and then, of course, the transatlantic slave trade, bringing millions of Africans to Americas against their will. Okay, so last thing I'm going to talk about with Unit 1 is the new monarchies. Okay, this describes the changing attitudes and style of rule by some monarchies in the 15th and 16th centuries. All right, resulted in the following effects, though: growing power of the monarchy, centralization of government, and the establishing of domestic order, the building of standing militaries, and finally the creation of a national feeling, sentiment, attitude, whatever you want to go with. So these new monarchies, this wasn't happening in every country, but it was happening in a lot of countries, and we can kind of turn to a few specific ones here. So first, in the top right, we got our boy Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Austria, King of Spain, of the Netherlands, of all of Europe, pretty much. He's a good example of a new monarchy. He's someone who he really views himself in a very nationalist sense, as someone who wants to establish a strong central government. He doesn't want to necessarily share power. But he also views himself as a statesman, as someone who has to make really smart, good decisions. Underneath him, we got Henry VII of England, okay, the first of the Tudors. Another really good example of that. Someone who he sees what the War of the Roses does to England, and he curbs the power of the nobility. Again, creating a centralized government. On the left, we got Francis I of France, longtime enemy of Charles V. Kind of does the same thing in France, like I was just talking about. This is our predecessors for absolute monarchs, okay, right here. But the new monarchs are not considered absolute monarchs. the AP exam from last year had a question on the new monarchies. Go take a look at it to kind of see the frame in which College Board wants you to think about new monarchies. But that is enough of Unit 1. Let's jump to Unit 2. All right. Unit 2 is Reformation and Wars of Religion. All right. A deceivingly very big unit here. All right. There's you can go through this one pretty quickly, but you're going to miss some important stuff if you don't take your time with it. So when we're thinking about the main ideas of this, of course, we have to start with Martin Luther and Luther's Reformation. That is definitely very important here. Sorry, guys. Excuse me. All right. That is definitely important here, thinking about Luther and his Reformation, but also reformations outside of Germany. Okay. The Catholic Reformation, the Wars of Religion. Okay. So those are the main ideas of Unit 2. Like I said, it's a deceivingly small unit, but it's got some really important meaty stuff in there. So really quickly, I want to talk about an overview of Reformation. First of all, this is a split within the Catholic Church. Okay, this is not a creation of a new religion. This is still Christianity, but it leads to the creation of several Protestant denominations. It's the creation of several Protestant denominations. This is not a rejection of Christianity or Christian ideology, all right? And that is really important to say. That's something that a lot of my students get really hung up on, is they can't. It's tough to wrap your head around the fact that this isn't a new religion. Okay, this is still Christianity. Okay, it's not like Catholicism is its own religion here. Okay, no, this is still all Christianity. And so that can be kind of tough, but this is separate from Catholicism, but still in the umbrella of Christianity here. Okay. So thinking about why does it happen? So first of all, the Renaissance, right? History is just one long big cause and effect. The Renaissance are exactly why it happens. General dissatisfaction with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church hadn't exactly been in the best terms with a lot of people in Europe. The Catholic Church seemed to be taking advantage of people. It was a political machine more than it was a religious machine. The Great Schism is a good example of that. Now, looking at the major denominations that result from this, first of all, of course, we have Luther and the Lutherans, but also Calvin, the Huguenots in France, which are a branch off of Calvinists, Henry the VIII and Elizabeth I in the Anglican Church, which we'll talk about here in a second. And I also like to talk about Presbyterianism, because Presbyterianism pops up when we talk about the English Civil War and James I and the Scots coming to rule England. Presbyterianism is an offshoot of Calvinism, or not Calvin, yeah, Calvinism. So those are our major denominations. And I know I'm moving fast, guys. Like I said, go back and watch the video. PowerPoint's going to be posted. It's a lot of stuff, but unfortunately, it's just this class just has a lot of content, so we got to move through it. Now, let's talk about Martin Luther. Okay, he is the one that is credited with starting the Reformation. Pretty rightfully so. He's definitely the catalyst here. Okay, whether it would have happened or not, it probably would have happened eventually, but it lands on him. And Luther's understanding. If you're going to remember one thing from Luther, remember this phrase: salvation by faith alone. That is Luther's whole understanding encapsulated in a big single phrase: salvation by faith alone. All right. This sometimes just means only faith will lead to salvation. Okay, not good works, not going and buying a oh my gosh, what am I thinking of? Indulgence. There we go. Not going out and buying an indulgence, but actually just having faith. Also, he believes that salvation is a gift from God. It's not something that needs to be earned. This kind of was one of his really big struggles was this idea that you had to earn salvation. He says that's not the case, that salvation is something that is granted by God to all of his believers. And also that the church itself cannot save you. Only faith can save you. He would argue that you can go out into the woods with a Bible and you have just as much chance of going to heaven as the guy who goes to church every single day. Okay. Now, famously, Luther publishes his 95 Theses, nails it to the church door of Wittenberg, and that kind of kicks things off. It was really an attack on the selling of indulgences. It wasn't. It does talk broadly about bigger problems within the church, but really it's focused on the selling of indulgences more than anything else. It is addressed to the Pope. Okay. Luther's convinced that the Pope has no idea this is going on. And if he explains why it's a problem, the Pope will agree. Obviously, we know that's not true. The Pope doesn't agree, but that's why it's addressed. It's addressed to the Pope, and it's also addressed to the Archbishop of Mainz, who was selling indulgences, or who had ordered the selling of indulgences in and around Wittenberg, where Luther lived. Now, eventually, Luther is going to break with the church, and this is going to open up a floodgate of religious reform. Okay, so Luther is the catalyst here, for sure. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Reformation outside of Germany. Zwingli and Calvin, who set up Reformed churches in Switzerland. Zwingli's beliefs aligned very, very closer to Luther's. He actually debates Luther. He has a conversation with Luther, and they only agree on one single thing. Luther says that while the Eucharist or communion is symbolic, Luther says that Jesus is present, that Jesus is present during that time. And Zwingli says that's nonsense, that Jesus is not present. It's all symbolic. And that's the one thing they disagree on. And they say, we were so close. We were so close to setting up a single Reformed church in Europe, but it just doesn't happen. Kind of one of those interesting what if moments if they could have agreed. But Calvin's beliefs are going to be kind of more broadly are going to line up with Luther's, but they are going to they're going to more broadly line up with Luther's, but they are going to be fundamentally also different. Calvin's beliefs are all centered around predestination, the idea that it's already determined whether you're going to heaven or hell. It's already determined if you're going to heaven or hell, and it's also based on a very strict, moral-driven lifestyle. So those are some key differences between the two of them there. Of course, the Anglican Reformation. This is much more politically based. Replace the King of England, or replace the Pope with the King of England. Pretty much, the hierarchy is just flipped. It keeps the same hierarchy, but the King is now the head of the English Church. This is seen in the Act of Supremacy, which is passed by Henry VIII. However, it's really Elizabeth that solidifies Anglicanism in England. The Elizabethan Compromise, which the Elizabethan Compromise, which keeps a lot of says we're going to keep a lot of the same ideologies of and ideas of Catholicism, but we are going to make sure that everybody goes to church on Sunday, which that's pretty much what the Elizabethan Compromise says, and this really solidifies Anglicanism. As you know, it's not going anywhere, pretty much. All right. So I also got to talk about the Catholic Reformation, of course, with the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent, which called for wide-scale changes within the Catholic Church. They did not call for doctrinal changes. It called for changes for how the church acted, pretty much. And this is just really a response to the Protestant Reformation. So it did two things. First, it reaffirmed Catholic doctrine, and it also reformed corruption. Reaffirming Catholic doctrine, it reaffirmed the importance of the seven sacraments. It reaffirmed the importance of the Catholic authority and the clergy. So pretty much by saying the Pope is important. Reaffirmed the importance of good works, but it also reformed corrupt practices. Clergy cannot hold multiple offices. They must be educated. So we see the creation of seminaries. Clergy must live in the area that they work in. And then real quick, I want to talk about the Jesuits, which are also wrapped up in this. This is a religious order that develops during the time of Reformation, focused on educating people, on missionary work, setting up schools, etc., etc. The Jesuits are started by Ignatius of Loyola. They are pretty much just do the Catholic Church's bidding, effectively. All right, and then finally, let's talk about wars of religion. This is going to be real quick. These are mostly caused by the religious split during the Reformation. So these are a direct result of the Reformation. They are also focused on long-standing political divides. So famously, the wars of religion aren't just focused on religion. They're also definitely focused on political issues as well. The French Wars of Religion. This is Catholics versus Huguenots. It's going to result in the ascension of Henry IV to the French throne. He's the first of the Bourbon kings. He passes the Edict of Nantes, which grants large-scale religious freedom for Huguenots. Also, the 30 Years' War is really important here. The 30 Years' War, there are four main phases of this. Famously, this is something that I think Tom Ritchie has a really good video of this on this. So I gotta give credit for Tom Ritchie whenever I talk about the 30 Years' War, because he talks about the four main phases here, with Bohemian being local and religious, Danish being local and religious, Dutch being continental and political, and French being also continental and political. Okay, I'm not going to dig too much into that because I can talk about the 30 Years' War for the next 30 minutes. But go look at those. Go into your textbook, or go and watch the past five videos and look at the 30 Years' War, because it is really important. But the big piece of importance here is the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia completely redraws the map of Europe. Widespread religious toleration for not only Lutherans and Catholics, but also Calvinists are finally thrown in there. And this overall just ends all the religious wars in Europe from here on out. Okay, so the Peace of Westphalia is seen as this massive turning point in world history. It's why the period one ends with the Peace of Westphalia. All right, so I can already tell we have about 15 minutes until my hour is up. So I'm going to try to move quick here, get through as much as we can. But we are on to unit number 3, Absolutism versus Constitutionalism. So the main ideas of Absolutism versus Constitutionalism. One, you have the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, different approaches to absolutism across Europe, Mercantilism, and finally the Dutch Golden Age and the rise of Prussia. Okay, so these are the big takeaways here of Unit 3. So let's start with talking about the English Civil War. So James I and his son Charles I, they are, after the Tudor dynasty dies out with Elizabeth I, they are brought in from Scotland to rule. Well, James I is, and then his son Charles I, who succeeds him. But they want to rule as absolute monarchs. This is a problem because the English Parliament exists. All right, the English Parliament is established by the Magna Carta hundreds of years prior to this. All right, so it's not going anywhere. And this is going to really put a damper on the fact that they want to rule as absolute monarchs. Charles I then disbands Parliament several times. Eventually, this will lead to the English Civil War. The English Civil War, there are the two groups here, Cavaliers and Roundheads. Cavaliers are those that are loyal to the king, while Roundheads are those that are loyal to Parliament. The war will eventually end with the execution of Charles I. Following that, you have the Puritan dictatorship under Oliver Cromwell, which I'm not going to dig into now just because of lack of time, but I would go review it. The Glorious Revolution, where James II, who is going to succeed his brother Charles II, who was placed on the throne after the Puritan dictatorship. I know there's a lot of like British monarchy lineage stuff. You just got to kind of know some of them. You got to know James I, Charles I, Charles II, James II. You got to know that order. But James II is seen as tyrannical by Parliament. Really, this is religiously motivated. James II is a Catholic, and he has a Catholic son. That's pretty much it. And he's seen as this tyrannical king, ignoring the wills of Parliament, which is partially true, but really it was religious. Parliament didn't want to deal with a Catholic king. They needed an Anglican king. So what do? They sent out an invitation to William of Orange and Mary Scott, his wife, to overthrow James II, and that's Mary's father. And the kind of the trade-off here is say, hey, you can have the English throne, which that's pretty sweet, but you got to sign the English Bill of Rights. And this is going to be one of the big turning points in British history, where William and Mary are going to rule now officially as constitutional monarchies. All right, so constitutionalism is going to reign supreme in England. And the big takeaway here is that eventually this is going to put England down a path towards the cabinet system that they have today, where a monarchy still exists, but they don't do anything. Really, it's Parliament, and really it's not even a Parliament. It's one house in Parliament. It's the House of Commons that makes all the decisions in government. So the English Bill of Rights, it starts it on that way. Okay, so England never fully experiences absolutism like a place like France or Russia or Prussia or Austria does, simply due to the fact that they have this English Bill of Rights, and they've kind of always had that limited government exist with Parliament just existing. Okay, so that's very, very quickly Civil War, English Civil War, and the Glorious Revolution. You can and you should study this for a while, but this is just very simply, this is very sped up. Okay. Now, on to our boy Louis. So we'll talk about approaches to absolutism, looking specifically at Louis XIV and Peter the Great. So France and Louis XIV, he is the model absolute king. Okay, and power is going to really start to grow under Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu, who is the king regent for Louis XIV's predecessor, Louis XIII. Cardinal Richelieu is going to focus on not only strengthening the power of France, but more specifically strengthening the power of the monarchy. And he's going to do this in a lot of different ways, by curbing the power of the nobility, by curbing the power of the Habsburgs. Okay, but this is going to set up Louis XIV in a really good state to be able to expand his absolute power and create a model absolute state in Europe. Okay, we can see this specifically with the Palace of Versailles, the palace that Louis XIV has built. It's going to be the center of French government for the next 200 years. 200 years, like, yeah, I guess more like 100 years, I guess 150 years. But this is absolutism in its physical form, in its physical manifestation, as the Palace of Versailles. Okay, it showcased the prestige of the monarchy. It showcased everything that absolutism was supposed to be. Now the Louis XIV, he rules by divine right. The idea that God placed him there and that he is next in line. He is God's representative on earth, right? He is just below God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit, the whole shebang. Okay. He also kind of in turn revokes the Edict of Nantes. Famously, Louis believes that he must to successfully be a successful king, you got to rule by one king, one law, and one faith. All right. Louis XIV personally could really care less about Huguenots, but it conflicted with his ideology that in order to be successful, in order to rule peacefully, there could only be one faith. So he revokes the Edict of Nantes. We're going to see a large amount of French Huguenots bail out of France and go elsewhere. And he also engages in costly war for little gain. The War of Spanish Succession is a great example of this. Okay, he's going to lose a lot and gain a little. Yeah, he puts a Bourbon on the Spanish throne, but he loses a lot of valuable territory. So you have some pictures of Versailles, which I'm going to quickly go through because we only have about 10 minutes left before I have to cut it off. But I want to quickly talk about Peter the Great, Russian Tsar. Okay, his big goals here. He wants to westernize Russia. He builds a warm water port, St. Petersburg. He establishes the table of ranks. The idea that your privileges were based on what you actually did for the country. All in all, he grabs Russia by the beard and makes them a European continental power, pretty much. But Peter the Great's important to know. I mean, he's regarded in the same way as Louis XIV. Okay, important guy. Mercantilism. Okay, the economic theory that a country's power is measured in its wealth, and through accumulation of that wealth. Wealth should be accumulated and protected. All right, you don't want to get rid of it. So that encourages setting up colonies and encourages creating monopolies. It encourages the government controlling everything here. Okay, all for accumulation of wealth. Now, this is going to eventually lead to capitalism. We see this with their joint stock companies, like the Dutch East India Company is an early venture into joint stock companies, but also the British Tea Company, excuse me, and this is going to eventually lead to our more capitalist focused economy, kind of going out of the 1700s into the 1800s. What else do we need to say about mercantilism? If you're going to remember one guy from mercantilism, no, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Louis XIV's finance minister. He's going to adopt a lot of what he deems pretty successful mercantilist policies. He's actually horrified with the fact that Louis XIV just goes off and wastes all this money on wars. Now, this is obviously, we know this is a problematic economic idea. Spain's going to witness this firsthand when it bankrupts itself because it just gets too much silver. It experiences hyperinflation where silver is literally worthless because they find a mountain of the stuff. It's so bad, in fact, that they also crash China's economy. But quickly, let's. I want to talk about the rise of Prussia and the Dutch Golden Age. Something that kind of happens tangentially in the 1600s. Prussia benefits greatly from the Treaty of Westphalia, and they are able to accumulate a substantial amount of power and land and autonomy. It's Frederick William I that sets up Prussia as this military state. They're kind of seen as like a modern day Sparta. The Dutch Golden Age, they dominate trade in Europe for about 100 years. They dominate the spice trade in India. The center of banking in Europe for about 100 years before that is going to really shift gears and go to Britain. So if we want to think about it here, like trade is dominated first by Italy, then by the Dutch, and then finally by Britain. Okay, I have just about 7 minutes. Let's see how quick we can do this. We are probably not going to get to the French Revolution. I'll just say that now, which is great because I'm not in the French Revolution in class yet either. I'm starting that tomorrow, so it kind of works out. Anyway, let's talk about the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, and the old regime here. Okay, so first of all, main ideas of all of this. 1, the Scientific Revolution, of course. 2 is the Enlightenment. 3, society in the 18th century. And then finally wrap things up with enlightened absolutism. Okay. So again, Unit 4 is a really strange unit, and that's what I tell my students is that this is not going to be a unit that's comfortable to learn. First of all, the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment, they're really big ideas. It's a lot of stuff to remember, but it's not. It's like also just more remembering ideology and remembering ideas, picking and choosing who you want to remember. And then the old regime, which is the 18th century Europe. It's just a lot of nitty-gritty, nitpicky content, honestly. So it's a strange unit. It's a lot of setup. It's a lot of setup for Unit 5. But let's take a look at what Europe looks like here going into the 1700s. This is Europe. We can see that the Holy Roman Empire is still pretty jacked up, although the Peace of Westphalia, one big thing it does is that it pretty much completely neuters any power that the Holy Roman Empire had Holy Roman Emperor can't do anything anymore. It's a title. That's it. Okay. So it allows for countries like Brandenburg, Prussia, and Austria, and Hungary, and a lot of those Central European powers to really start rising in power. And power, it's like energy. It's not created. It's not destroyed. When someone loses energy, when someone loses power, another person gains power. Okay, that's how the game is played. Poland. We'll talk about Poland here in just a second. Poor Poland. But we can see the Ottoman Empire is still definitely around as well. The Ottoman Empire is going to kind of keep hanging on, although they really fall out of grace in the 1700s. They just kind of really fall behind the rest of Europe. So the Scientific Revolution. First of all, this is a slow-moving development. It does not happen overnight. It's a very, very slow-moving development, and the slow-moving development of modern scientific theory. Copernicus and Kepler being point to this. Copernicus with the heliocentric theory, Kepler with the elliptical movement of the planets. Popularization of science is also really big here with Galileo and Kepler. Galileo, of course, he discovers a lot of celestial bodies, but also popularizes the heliocentric theory. Kepler, of course, gravity. He also messes around with light and with optics. Or Newton. I said Kepler. Newton, not Kepler. Newton. Both of these guys, that they are going to be popular. It's not necessarily true with their earlier predecessors. Science becomes more popular in the 16 and 1700s, okay? Really, in the early 1700s, science is incredibly popular. It's being learned. It's being taught. It's part of the crucial part of education. That's just not really the case before the late 1700s. The use of empirical evidence as well. That's scientific method, right? We all had to do the scientific method. We have to do the scientific method all the time in high school history. You get a hypothesis and you test it. Okay, you test something, that's empirical evidence right there. Okay, guys. So with the Enlightenment, the development of new philosophical and intellectual ideology. This is very, very purposeful, though. What I mean by that is that they knew what they were doing here. Okay, they knew that they were part of this grander, bigger event. They knew that what they were doing was important. They called themselves enlightened philosophers, right? Historians didn't make that one up. There's no set ideology, but there are a lot of big themes here. Okay, so not everybody believes all the same stuff, but what we do tend to see more generally is a call for religious toleration, a call for freedom of speech or more freedom of speech, a call for limited government, for government limiting itself, and a fair treatment of humanity. So death penalty and capital punishment. Right? Now, when we're thinking about Enlightenment philosophers to know, this is when things can kind of get tricky because there's so many of them. But I think these are the big ones. These are the big ones. If you know them and you know what their ideas were, you're going to be in good shape. Okay, Voltaire's religious toleration through and through. He's also kind of like he's like the enlightened philosopher's philosopher. You know, he's incredibly popular. He travels around and trances around Europe, writing a lot and talking a lot and meeting with rulers and pretty much staying until he's overstayed his welcome and then he gets kicked out. But he talks a lot about religious toleration. He also talks a lot about how Europe can learn a lot from other countries and from other cultures. Montesquieu, separation of powers, right? Balance of power within government. Okay, that's all Montesquieu. Rousseau's the oddball out here a little bit. Incredibly unpopular during his lifetime, but gets very, very popular after he dies. He talks about a lot of different stuff. He talks about educational reform with his book Emile. He talks about social reform and how society corrupts the individual, and that we must live in a morally just society in order to be successful human beings effectively. Wollstonecraft, women's rights. Mary Wollstonecraft, women's rights. She's one of our early feminists. Talks about how important women are to society and to humanity. Cesare Beccaria. Cesare Beccaria talks about no capital punishment, no death penalty. Okay. And then finally, Dennis Diderot. Okay. Dennis Diderot, encyclopedia. Okay. Sharing of information, sharing of knowledge. Everybody should have access to it. That's Diderot. right? So I think if you know those 6, you're in good shape. If you know 5 of the 6, you're in good shape. I think those are really the big ones. I might be missing one, but those for me, if one of my students knew those 6 and only those 6, I'd be fine. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about societal developments. The growing populations. Europe's population grows by about 1 million people in 100 years, which is a huge amount of people. And really, the problem that we're going to run into is that resources can't keep up. The growth of the middle class. The growth of the middle class here. Excuse me. The growth of the middle class here is going to be really important later on when we talk about the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. Increased literacy rates across Europe. Generally speaking, European literacy rates increased to about 40% in most urban areas, which is huge. Then, of course, the agricultural revolution. Specifically, make sure you're looking at enclosure movement and cottage industry. But real quick, we're going to wrap up Unit 4 by looking at the enlightened despots. Catherine the Great of Russia attempted legal code reform, reformed educational systems. Frederick the Great of Prussia, codification of laws, abolishing torture and capital punishment, religious toleration. And then Joseph II of Austria, one of the sadder rulers we talk about here, because he's got such good ideas, ending serfdom, legal and tax reform, educational reform, but all of this never really pans out for him. He tries to do it after he dies; most of it's revoked. He just really doesn't have the leadership wherewithal to keep it going. But Joseph II, he's an interesting guy. He's a really interesting enlightened despot. I would encourage you guys to take some time and really look into him a little bit more. All right, the partitioning of Poland, I got to mention. Okay, the Poland's the 3rd largest country in Europe, but it lacks no central government. Incredibly weak. It's pretty much just run by the nobility, and the king doesn't do anything. And so Russia, Austria, and Prussia annex it over 3 separate times until eventually it's gone. Okay, they completely wipe Poland off the face of the earth. Poland's not going to exist until after World War I in 1918. Okay, but it puts these 3 countries, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, as the dominant powers in Central Europe. After the annexation of Poland, no one can say that these 3 countries are not the 3 strongest countries in Central Europe. All right, that's why it's so important. Also, some crucial wars here: the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War are really important. Okay, and then the diplomatic revolution, the shifting of Austria and France being enemies to being allies. What this speaks more broadly to is balance of power, the importance of balance of power. The 7 Years' War and the War of Austrian Succession is Prussian aggression, and also 7 Years' War is a good example also of balance of power, where all of Europe joins together to stop the Prussians. All right, and that is the end of Unit 4. I will very quickly talk about Unit 5, but like I said, I'll have this PowerPoint posted. Go take a look at Unit 5. I don't really get into crazy detail with the French Revolution because it's so complex that I have to be broad with it, or else I'd spend an hour and a half talking about it. But the main ideas here is Britain on top. Okay, starting by talking about how does Britain adopt the cabinet system, the French Revolution, the rise and fall of Napoleon, and then finally wrapping things up with the Congress of Vienna. With the British dominance, Britain is able to economically situate itself as the dominant power in Europe. They do this by doing a good job of staying out of continental affairs. Of course, they get involved with war in the colonies in North America, but for the most part, they do a good job of making sure that they're not really hardcore committing to anything in the continent. This is gonna really allow them to pull away from the rest of the pack, and they just dominate trade in Europe. They also adopt the cabinet system. This is early representative government with Parliament Parliament and the king really working together here, and limiting the Parliament, thus limiting the power of the king. And this is precursor to a true representative government. They also established key trade relationships with North America and, more importantly, with Asian countries, specifically India, to dominate the Indian spice trade. So this is by the 1700s, Britain is now the dominant economic power in Europe, and they're really going to stay the dominant economic power in Europe until after World War II. They're going to really be the dominant power in the world economically until after World War II. You make the case the United States has something to say about that, but really it's Britain. Now, the French Revolution, the causes of this, of course, there are long-term and short-term political and economic causes. But the French estate system, clergy, nobility, and everybody else, first, second, and third estate. The Enlightenment also, big cause of this. What we were just talking about, representative government, limited government, all of that good stuff. That's going to really limit the... It's going to really encourage people to question their own government, to question the way society is set up. And we can kind of divide up the French Revolution into three phases. The first phase, or the liberal phase. This is when we see the establishment of a constitutional monarchy, increasing the franchise, or increasing who can vote, although for the most part, it's not many people who can vote, nationalizing the Catholic Church, abolishing the estate system and hereditary privileges. The second phase is the radical phase. This is when the king is executed, the radical Jacobin club takes power, Committee of Public Safety is suspended, a reign of terror, which is their wording, is instituted to combat enemies abroad and at home. And then also France is de-Christianized, which is huge. The last phase, the Directory, or the third phase, attempting to undo the terror, largely very unsuccessful though, and allows for the rise of Napoleon. And thus we get the rise and fall of Napoleon. Securing power for himself, achieving domestic popularity, mostly by way of legal and religious reforms, but also just giving stability to France, which French people really wanted. Wages war across Europe with wide-scale success. Spreads revolutionary ideas and raises nationalism as a popular idea. The Congress of Vienna as well, or the Congress of Vienna, not as well, but the Congress of Vienna really wraps things up here. The Congress of Vienna is really just Europe coming together after Napoleon is defeated in 1815 and saying, what the heck just happened? How do we fix it? Europe attempts to restore balance of power, wants to make sure another Napoleon never happens again. This is going to be the Congress of Vienna, I think, is just as important as the Peace of Westphalia, where it's a mentality shift. Europe says, look, we cannot allow another Napoleon to happen. We have to be more vigilant. We have to be willing to talk. We have to be willing to look at diplomacy as a strategy and not just war. And they want to go, and also they want to go back to a time before the revolution. They want to go back to a time where kings had power and other people didn't. They wanted a time where there was hereditary privilege and there was feudal privilege. And generally speaking, this will achieve several decades of peace. The Crimean War is probably the largest conflict of the 1800s in Europe itself. The 1848 revolutions also, but in terms of like continental conflict, the Crimean War, really this is going to achieve continental peace until, use that in quotes, until 1914. So it almost lasts for 100 years of peace. And then of course we know what happens with World War I. The powder keg explodes. All right. Oh my God. I am tired. That was all of Unit 1. I mean, not all of Unit 1. Oh, all of Semester 1 summed up in about an hour. So again, I went fast. I didn't give anything really the time it deserved. But I encourage you to use this as a jumping off point, saying, okay, what do I need to review? What am I not familiar with? And also use this as general review. Okay. If you have questions, Go back and watch some old Fiveable videos. Message me on Twitter. There's plenty of resources out there for you guys. And Fiveable is certainly a good one. I know there are study guides either posted or about to be posted for AP Euro. So give those a look. But guys, thanks you for hanging in there with me. I thank you for your patience with this. And I will catch you guys all next time. Good luck for those that are doing midterms. Good luck for those that are kind of finishing up the semester. And I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful night and a great Friday tomorrow.